5 friends walked into the woods on a warm summer afternoon and were never seen again, leaving only silence where laughter once echoed. Years later, a single discovery revealed that the truth of what happened was far more terrifying than anyone had imagined. The October air was cool and sharp, carrying the smell of damp leaves and pine as 5 friends stepped off the gravel road and into the edge of Ashbury Forest. Their laughter was loud at first, bouncing between the trunks, but soon the woods swallowed it, leaving only the crunch of boots and the clink of gear as they made their way down the narrow trail. The plan had been simple: a weekend camping trip to celebrate the end of high school and the last autumn before they scattered toward jobs and college. 2 couples led the way, walking close with their hands brushing, while behind them trailed the youngest, a brother determined not to be left behind. They carried bright tents strapped to their packs, a cooler balanced on a small cart, and bags stuffed with food and blankets. One of them, Leela, wore her red scarf even though it was too warm for it, saying it would keep the forest spirits away. Her boyfriend Ryan teased her, tugging at the end of the scarf and laughing, but she only smiled, brushing hair from her eyes and hurrying ahead. Mark and Dana followed, steady and quiet, the kind of couple who spoke more in looks than in words. Behind them, Jesse, Mark's younger brother, carried a fishing pole over his shoulder, his eyes darting between the shadows like the woods were alive. The trees grew denser as they pressed deeper, their branches knitting overhead until the light thinned into pale streaks. They had promised their parents they would check in by evening, but reception dropped quickly, the signal fading the further they went. Ryan joked about leaving the modern world behind, calling the forest a kingdom untouched by time, but Dana frowned at the way the air grew still, as though the forest was listening. By late afternoon they reached a clearing near a stream, a perfect place to camp. They built a fire, roasted marshmallows, and told stories that carried into the dusk. Lila sang softly, her scarf glowing red in the firelight, and for a moment it felt like the world outside did not exist. When the fire burned low, they crawled into their tents, their voices drifting into silence under the cold sweep of the stars. The morning never came for the waiting families. The 5 friends did not return. By Sunday evening, the parents were pacing, calling phones that rang unanswered. By Monday, the police were notified, and the gravel road was crowded with vehicles, search dogs straining against their leashes as they pulled toward the woods. Volunteers carried flashlights and shouted names into the trees, their voices swallowed by the same silence that had taken the 5. No trace was found in those first frantic days, only the abandoned cars left at the edge of the forest, their doors locked, their radios still tuned to the same local station. The town whispered, and by the end of that week Ashbury Forest was no longer a place for picnics or Sunday walks. It was a place of absence, a place that had closed around 5 young lives and refused to let them go. The town of Ashbury was small enough that news traveled faster than the morning train, and by the second day of the friends' disappearance, panic had taken root like a fire creeping through dry grass. Mothers gathered at the diner clutching coffee cups they never drank from, their voices low but sharp, while fathers stood in tight clusters on the courthouse steps, arms folded across their chests as if bracing against something they could not fight. The forest had taken their children, and no one could understand how it had happened without a sound, without a trace. Flyers were printed hastily at the library, the ink still smudging under desperate fingers, each sheet carrying the smiling faces of Lila, Ryan, Mark, Dana, and Jesse. Shop windows filled with their images. Lampposts were plastered until the town looked less like itself and more like a place haunted by ghosts who had not yet been declared dead. Children whispered in school hallways, wondering if monsters lived in the woods, while teachers tried to keep order, though their own eyes darted constantly toward the empty desks. The sheriff's office, usually a quiet corner where parking tickets and petty arguments filled the blotter, became the center of a storm. Telephones rang without pause. Volunteers signed their names on clipboards, and deputies handed out flashlights and maps with the grim faces of men who knew time was against them. Each passing hour pulled the hope of a simple explanation further away. On the second night, search parties returned empty, their boots muddy, their eyes hollow. The sound of them coming back through town was almost worse than the silence of their leaving, because each time families rushed to meet them with hope sparking in their chests, only to see the weary shake of a head or the slow lowering of a flashlight. It was a rhythm of hope and despair that wore the town down to its bones. Arguments broke out quickly, some accusing the sheriff of not moving fast enough, others blaming the parents for letting their children camp in the forest at all. Old grudges resurfaced, fanned by grief, and yet beneath the anger lay a shared fear that bound everyone together. Ashbury was not a place where children vanished, at least not until now. By the third morning, the town square was crowded with reporters carrying cameras and microphones, their questions sharp and careless, cutting through the fragile calm like knives. The parents turned away from them, shielding their faces, while the sheriff spoke briefly of ongoing efforts and refused to speculate. Behind his words lay the truth everyone already felt. The forest had swallowed 5 young people whole, and the more they searched, the less sense it made. At night the town grew unbearably quiet. Doors locked early, lights burning in windows until dawn. Ashbury had always been a place of safety, but with each passing day it became something else entirely. A town marked by fear, a town waiting for news it did not want to hear. The search for the 5 missing friends spread across Ashbury Forest like a fever that would not break. By the 4th day, the narrow roads leading into the woods were jammed with vehicles, some belonging to police cruisers and ranger trucks, others driven by neighbors who had come to help with nothing more than flashlights and determination. Helicopters swept the treetops, their blades chopping the air in steady rhythm, while below them volunteers formed lines and pushed into the undergrowth, calling out names that vanished into the green silence. The forest was vast, more than 20 square miles of tangled roots, steep ridges, and marshy ground, and for every step forward it seemed to push them 2 steps back. Dogs strained against their leashes, noses buried in leaves that carried too many scents. At times they barked sharply, sending a surge of hope through the lines, but each time it ended with nothing more than a fox den or a cluster of deer tracks. Deputies hung strips of orange ribbon to mark where they had been, yet the markers soon fluttered uselessly in the wind as the scale of the task became clear. People began to whisper that the forest itself was swallowing every effort, hiding its secrets with a patience no human could match. The sheriff ordered divers into the streams and ponds, fearing that the children might have fallen in and drowned. Murky water yielded only weeds and mud, the divers surfacing with pale faces and shaking heads. Old hunting cabins were pried open, their doors creaking to reveal nothing more than dust and the faint smell of mildew. Rangers combed through caves with lanterns, their voices echoing back in hollow repetition, as though the earth itself was mocking them. Each day ended the same way. The sun dipped behind the ridges and the teams returned to town, their bodies caked in mud, their throats raw from shouting. Families waited near the courthouse, clutching at the sleeves of anyone in uniform, their eyes searching for a sign, but no sign ever came. Tents were set up in the school gymnasium to house out-of-town volunteers, but even the sight of strangers eager to help could not ease the ache of failure. By the end of the first week, exhaustion dulled the sharp edge of panic and left only a heavy despair. The maps on the sheriff's wall were covered in red lines showing where they had already searched, until the forest looked less like a landscape and more like a wound. Yet no matter how many paths they crossed, no matter how many ridges they climbed, the friends remained gone, as though the trees themselves had closed in behind them. The word that no one wanted to say began to take shape in hushed corners of the diner and whispered prayers in the church pews. Lost. Not wandering, not hiding, but lost in a way that meant they might never be found. The first week of searching bound the families together, mothers clinging to one another, fathers pacing the courthouse steps with shoulders squared and jaws set, united by fear and the desperate hope that their children would stumble back out of the woods alive. But as the days stretched into weeks, cracks began to appear in the fragile bond that grief had built. The courthouse meetings turned tense, voices rising over the sheriff's updates, arguments breaking out over what had been done and what had been missed. Ryan's father accused Mark of leading the group too far off the trail, his words sharp with blame, while Mark's mother snapped back that it was Ryan who had always pushed boundaries, who had insisted on taking risks that no one else wanted. At one meeting, Dana's mother burst into tears, insisting that if only Jesse had not begged to come along, the trip might never have happened at all. Her grief spilled into blame, and the younger boy's parents sat in stunned silence, their faces pale with the weight of words that could not be taken back. The sheriff tried to calm them, reminding everyone that the forest was to blame, not the children, but his words fell flat against the raw pain of parents who could not find an answer. Old grudges began to surface, feuds that had slept for years now fed by fear. Ryan's uncle spoke of debts owed and kindness never returned, while Mark's father muttered about reckless parenting. Every conversation seemed to circle back to who had failed, who had not done enough, who had made the choice that had led to this vanishing. At the church vigils, once marked by quiet prayers and candles flickering in the autumn wind, whispers crept through the pews. Some said one family was too calm, too resigned, as though they knew more than they admitted. Others claimed that certain parents were seeking attention, that their tears were for themselves, not the children. The unity that had held the town together began to fracture into suspicion, each family guarding their grief as though it were a secret no one else could share. Home lives changed as well. Meals were eaten in silence, or not at all. Fathers sat in dark kitchens staring at cold cups of coffee, while mothers walked from room to room, folding blankets that would not be used, smoothing pillows that no head would rest on. Siblings were left to watch the unraveling, their own pain buried under the weight of parents who seemed to fight more with each passing night. By the end of the month, the search parties had thinned, fewer volunteers arriving each day. The families, once bound together by shared purpose, now avoided each other in the market and crossed streets to keep from speaking. What had started as a community united against a cruel mystery had become a gathering of broken homes, each family splintering under the unbearable truth that the children were still gone and that someone, somehow, must be at fault. The search had stretched past its first month, and though the official line was that hope remained, the town of Ashbury no longer believed in simple answers. With no bodies, no belongings beyond a few scraps, and no clear trail, the silence around the 5 missing friends grew heavier each day. In that silence, theories began to sprout like weeds through cracked pavement. At first, the whispers stayed soft, shared in kitchens or over coffee at the diner, but soon they spread across the town until everyone carried their own version of what had happened in the forest. Some believed the group had been attacked by wild animals. The forest was home to black bears, coyotes, even rumors of mountain lions wandering down from the northern ridges. It was an easy story to tell, one that explained the suddenness, the vanishing without warning. Yet no blood had been found, no torn clothing, no bones, and the search dogs had not caught a single scent of fear or violence. The idea was strong for a week, then faded as quickly as it had risen. Others spoke of human hands. Hunters knew the forest well, and more than one drifter had been caught trespassing near old cabins in years past. Some whispered of men who followed no laws, who used the deep woods to hide things better left unspoken. The idea of abduction spread fast, and soon every stranger in town was met with suspicion. Every outsider eyed as if they might be carrying the secret of the 5 missing. There were those who reached for something darker still. Ashbury had always carried old stories, tales of lantern lights moving through the trees without wind, of voices calling from nowhere, of figures glimpsed between the branches. Most dismissed these as nonsense told by hunters after too much drink, but with 5 young lives gone, the stories no longer seemed so easy to laugh off. At the church vigil, one old woman stood and claimed the forest had claimed the children as payment, that it had been hungry for too long. Her words drew uneasy silence, and though the pastor tried to turn the moment into prayer, no one forgot what she had said. Theories divided the families further. Ryan's parents clung to the idea of a stranger's crime, demanding the sheriff search beyond Ashbury, while Mark's mother insisted the forest itself had swallowed them. Jesse's father believed in an accident, a fall into some hidden ravine, though the sheriff had already sent teams across every ridge. Dana's parents refused to speak in public, their silence feeding more speculation. Each theory gave comfort to some, and cut others open with new pain. By winter, the official search slowed, leaving only the whispers behind. In diners, in church pews, in school hallways, people repeated the same questions. Did the children run away? Did someone take them? Did the woods demand a price? With every passing day, the truth seemed further away, and the theories grew stronger, until they were the only thing left to hold on to. In the early weeks of the search, the sheriff clung to every scrap of evidence like a drowning man to driftwood, and the town followed with equal desperation. But each discovery that promised clarity only deepened the mystery. The first find came near the creek that cut through the northern edge of the forest, where a volunteer spotted a strip of fabric snagged on a thorn bush. It was pale blue, worn thin, and the size of it matched the sleeve of Dana's jacket. The piece was bagged, photographed, and carried back into town like a sacred relic. Yet no tracks were found nearby, no other sign that the friends had been there. Forensic tests confirmed it was a man-made fabric but yielded no blood, no struggle, no trace of the missing. A few days later, a search team found a cracked phone screen lying in the mud along the ridge trail. Ryan's parents held their breath, but the sheriff explained that the model was older, weathered by years in the elements. It could have belonged to any hiker, dropped long before the 5 entered the woods. Still, it was passed around at the courthouse meeting, the glass glittering in the fluorescent light as if it might whisper a truth no one else could hear. Hope surged again when a boot print was uncovered near the marshland, its edges crisp in the mud. It was photographed and measured, and the size suggested Jesse. The search focused heavily on the area, divers wading waist-deep into cold water, while deputies marked the ground with orange flags, but the trail ended after only a few feet. The print stood alone, isolated, as if the person who left it had stepped into the forest and then vanished into the air. The cruelest find was a charm bracelet, unearthed at the base of a cedar tree by a child who had come to help with her parents. Lila's mother collapsed when she recognized it, the tiny silver heart and chipped enamel star too familiar to mistake. For a brief moment, everyone believed the search was closing in, that the bracelet meant they were near the truth. Yet the earth around the tree was undisturbed, no footprints, no discarded belongings. The bracelet lay there as if placed on purpose, an offering or a cruel trick, and without context it became just another question added to the growing pile. Each piece of evidence was logged, sealed in bags, and lined up in the evidence room at the sheriff's office, a row of objects that held no answers. Volunteers began to lose faith, their shoulders sagging when another discovery proved useless. The forest seemed to mock them, offering scraps but no path, hints but no resolution. By the second month, the families stopped rushing to each meeting with expectant faces, because each time they left with heavier hearts. The evidence did not lead forward. It led nowhere at all. By the time winter settled over Ashbury, the search had shrunk to a shadow of what it had been in those frantic first weeks. The sheriff still held briefings, though fewer people came, and the maps on his office wall were no longer updated with fresh red lines. Deputies still walked the edges of the forest, but their steps were slower, their voices quieter, and even the dogs seemed to sense the futility. The case that once consumed the town was slipping into silence, and silence was far harder to bear than chaos. Families who had once stood shoulder to shoulder now kept to themselves, their grief turning inward. Ryan's father no longer attended the courthouse meetings, choosing instead to sit on his porch each evening with the porch light left burning, as if waiting for his son to walk up the steps. Dana's mother closed her curtains tight, refusing to see the flyers still taped to every lamppost, the faces of the five staring back as though asking why no one had come for them. The town itself seemed drained of color, shops quiet, church pews half empty, conversations clipped. The sheriff admitted what no one wanted to hear. Without new evidence, without fresh leads, the case would have to be scaled back. It was not a decision made in cruelty, but in exhaustion. The state investigators left, the helicopters no longer circled, and the field tents were packed away. What remained was a stack of files, a shelf of bagged belongings that explained nothing, and a forest that stood unbothered by human loss. Rumors filled the gap where official voices fell silent. Some claimed the friends had chosen to run away, that they had planned their vanishing all along, leaving behind parents who never really knew them. Others insisted that the forest had claimed them, that there was no explanation grounded in reason, only in something older and darker. These stories spread through the town like smoke, curling into every conversation until fact and fear became one. Time dulled the urgency but sharpened the sorrow. Anniversaries arrived, candles lit on the courthouse steps, prayers whispered into the autumn wind. The first year ended without answers, then the second. The flyers grew brittle in the rain, their colors fading, until they looked more like memorials than pleas for help. Children who had once spoken the missing names every day now grew older, their memories thinning, until the vanished became more legend than people. By the fifth year, Ashbury spoke of the missing friends less and less, as though saying their names might reopen a wound that had scabbed over. The case had grown cold, and though the sheriff still kept their files within reach, even he knew the truth. Without a miracle, the forest would never give them back. By the time 5 years had passed, the disappearance of the Ashbury friends had become more memory than headline, yet the case was never truly forgotten. Families kept their porch lights on, small vigils were still held each October, and the sheriff, older now and more tired, still kept the files stacked neatly on his desk. What changed was not the grief but the tools available. Technology had crept into even the quiet corners of Iowa, and it was this slow march forward that stirred the case back to life. In the early years, search parties had relied on maps drawn by hand and helicopters scanning the ridges with the naked eye. By the year 2019, hobbyists were flying drones over farmland, children were racing them in open fields, and small-town police departments were learning how to use them in training drills. When one of the new deputies suggested flying drones over Ashbury Forest, the idea seemed almost desperate, yet it offered something that had never been tried before. The forest could be seen from above in sharp detail, its canopies pierced by cameras able to tilt and hover in ways helicopters never could. At first, it was the families themselves who pushed the effort forward. Ryan's uncle had bought a drone for his construction business, using it to survey rooftops, and he offered to bring it into the woods. Soon others joined, hobbyists from nearby towns who had heard the story and wanted to help. They met on weekends, spreading out in the fields on the forest's edge, launching small buzzing machines into the sky. From the ground, they looked like insects circling high above the treetops, But on their monitors, the images were sharp and unsettling. They saw deer trails winding like veins through the undergrowth, creeks glittering with light, and in some places shadows where the trees grew so dense that even the cameras could not see through. The sheriff was cautious, reminding them that evidence had to be handled carefully, but even he admitted that the drones showed parts of the forest no one had managed to search fully before. Hours of video were stored on laptops, locals gathering at night in the town hall to watch the footage projected onto a wall. People leaned forward in their folding chairs, searching for any flicker of movement, any unnatural shape among the trees. It was both hopeful and painful, a reminder that answers might have been there all along, hidden in places no one had reached. The first months yielded nothing more than endless green and brown, the quiet pulse of the forest captured from above. Yet the very act of watching, the very use of this new technology, gave the town something it had lacked for years. It gave them motion. It gave them the sense that the forest was no longer an untouchable wall of silence, but something that could finally be seen, and perhaps, finally, be forced to reveal what it had hidden. The autumn of 2019 brought a crisp chill to Ashbury, the kind of weather that made the trees bleed gold and scarlet before the long sleep of winter. On a clear Saturday morning, a small group gathered at the edge of the forest, carrying drones, laptops, and thermoses of coffee. The sheriff had grown used to these gatherings, though he rarely attended, leaving the families and volunteers to chase whatever hope technology could provide. That day, Ryan's uncle was there, his construction drone fitted with a high-resolution camera, and Mark's older brother sat nearby, ready to record every second of flight. The machine lifted with a whirring hum, rising above the treetops until the forest stretched out like a vast green and gold ocean. On the laptop screen, the canopy rolled beneath them, ridges and valleys catching the light. At first it was nothing unusual, the familiar patterns of deer paths and streams glimmering in the sunday. But then, as the drone tilted north, something unexpected came into view. At the center of a dense hollow, hidden where the trees grew thickest, the camera caught the outline of a shape that was not natural. It was faint, half covered by branches, but clear enough to freeze every voice in the clearing. A rectangle of weathered wood, pale against the darkness of the forest floor, the roof of a structure that no map or memory claimed. The drone hovered, the camera zooming in, and the details sharpened. Shingles warped, patches of moss spreading across the surface, a chimney broken and leaning, a place that did not belong in any search record from years before. Someone whispered that it was a hunting cabin, but the sheriff, called quickly to the scene, shook his head. Every known cabin had been checked, and none matched what they saw now. This one sat in a hollow so steep it was nearly invisible from the ground, surrounded by a canopy so thick it would have taken days to reach on foot. It was not marked on any survey or deed. It had been hidden all this time, waiting. Excitement clashed with dread. Families leaned close to the screen, their hands trembling, whispering the names of their children as though the image itself could answer them. The sheriff ordered more drones launched, circling from different angles, capturing the shape from every side. The truth was undeniable. A structure stood in the heart of Ashbury Forest, untouched, unseen, concealed for at least 5 years. The discovery rippled through town before the drone even landed. Phones buzzed with messages, the diner filled with speculation, and the courthouse steps swarmed with reporters by evening. For the first time since the case had grown cold, there was something tangible, something new, something that might explain how 5 friends had walked into the woods and never returned. The forest had kept its secret, but now the sky had betrayed it, and everyone in Ashbury knew the silence was about to be broken. The discovery of the hidden structure in the drone footage changed everything. For 5 years, the case had been marked by silence, but now there was movement, sharp and immediate. Within days, the sheriff contacted the State Bureau, and unmarked trucks rolled back into Ashbury, carrying investigators who had once walked away with empty hands. Their arrival was quieter than the first search years before. No helicopters overhead, no long lines of volunteers, only a handful of professionals with cameras, scanners, and tools that seemed more suited for war than for the woods. The town watched from porches and storefronts as the officials gathered in the courthouse, maps spread across long tables, their fingers tracing paths through the forest. For the families, it was a reopening of old wounds, but it was also a chance, and chances were rare. Riley Shaw, who had lost her daughter Alara, stood outside the courthouse every day, her face drawn but steady, reminding anyone who would listen that the children had not been forgotten. Others kept their distance, fearful of hope that might collapse again, but their eyes followed every step the investigators took. When the team moved into the woods, the atmosphere shifted. Roads were blocked with sawhorses and tape, deputies posted at every trailhead. Reporters returned, microphones raised, their questions met with the same steady refusal. No comment. The scene is active. became the only word spoken by officials. Still, rumors moved through the town faster than facts, stories of new tracks, of heat signatures, of whispers picked up on strange devices. The sheriff's silence only fed the speculation. Inside the forest, the path to the structure was more difficult than the footage suggested. Dense brush clawed at uniforms, steep slopes slowed their progress, and equipment had to be carried on foot for miles. Drones hovered overhead again, guiding them closer, their cameras feeding images back to the command post set up in a field. The structure remained where the drone had first revealed it, silent and still, waiting in its hollow. From a distance it looked almost ordinary, like an abandoned cabin, but the secrecy of its location gave it weight, as though the woods themselves had worked to keep it hidden. Back in town, the families gathered at the diner, watching news reports on the mounted television, their faces tense. The footage showed little, only officials moving through trees, but the sight alone was enough to reignite the ache of waiting. Some prayed the children might still be found. Others feared what would happen if the truth was finally uncovered. For the first time in years, Ashbury was alive with the hum of expectation. The authorities had returned, the forest was being forced to give up its secrets, and everyone knew that soon, whether in relief or in horror, answers would come. The long silence of the vanished was breaking, and the weight of what might be revealed pressed heavily on every heart in town. When the authorities finally reached the hollow, they expected the structure to be the central mystery, but it was not the cabin that stopped them in their tracks. A few yards from the rotting roof, half hidden beneath vines and fallen leaves, stood something older and stranger, a ring of stone set deep into the earth. At first, the investigators thought it was the remains of a fire pit, but as they cleared the brush away, it became clear this was not a circle made for warmth. The stones were too large, too evenly placed, and too deliberate to be chance. Each stone stood upright, weathered by years of rain and moss, their surfaces scarred with markings that the team could not at first explain. Some were carved with lines and crude shapes, others gouged with patterns that seemed too intentional to be accidents. The circle was wide enough that 10 men could stand inside it shoulder to shoulder, and though the cabin sat only a short distance away, the stones felt far older, as if the structure had been built later in deference to them. The sheriff ordered photographs taken, every angle documented, and the state team brought in an archaeologist from the university in Des Moines. The expert knelt among the stones, brushing away dirt with a gloved hand, his brow furrowed as he traced the carvings. He admitted the work was primitive, perhaps local, perhaps no older than a century, yet the purpose of the circle was harder to define. Some in the team whispered that it looked ceremonial, like the remnants of a ritual long abandoned, but others dismissed it as nothing more than a curiosity left by settlers or hunters. The families heard about the discovery almost at once, and the theories spread like wildfire. In the diner, people spoke of cults, of secret gatherings deep in the woods, of old stories that had never been taken seriously until now. An elderly farmer claimed he had seen lanterns in that part of the forest as a boy, strange lights moving in the trees, and his words carried more weight than they ever had before. Parents who had long clung to the idea of a simple accident now faced the possibility of something darker, and that thought was almost too much to bear. The circle of stone became the center of every conversation in Ashbury. The cabin could be explained, an old hideout left to rot, but the stones resisted explanation. They stood silent, heavy with meaning that no one could decipher, and the markings seemed to mock the investigators with their mystery. Searchers walked the perimeter again and again, hoping to find clothing or belongings, but the earth gave up nothing. By evening, the sheriff admitted to the press that the circle existed, though he refused to speculate on its meaning. Still, the image spread across the internet, the aerial photo of moss-covered stones arranged in a perfect ring, and with it came renewed fear. The forest had revealed something, but it was not comfort. It was a question carved into the ground, a reminder that some secrets were older and heavier than the town had ever imagined. For weeks, the cabin and the circle of stone had been combed over by investigators, yet the families grew restless as no answers came. The sheriff gave careful statements, the experts spoke in guarded terms, and still the air in Ashbury buzzed with the same question that had lingered for 5 years. Where had the children gone? It seemed the new discoveries were only adding layers of confusion, until one afternoon, a small detail offered the first true breakthrough. A deputy was photographing the interior of the cabin when he noticed something faint, etched into the wood of the wall beside a cracked window. At first he thought it was damage left by weather or insects, but when the angle of the light shifted, the markings revealed themselves. Letters, rough and shallow, scratched by an unsteady hand. He leaned close, reading them aloud under his breath, and called for the sheriff. The words were simple, uneven, and terrifying in their clarity. 5 names, each belonging to one of the missing friends, carved into the timber with desperate strokes. The sheriff ordered the wall cut carefully from the cabin and transported under guard to the evidence room. Families were summoned to the courthouse, where the etchings were displayed under harsh fluorescent light. Parents leaned close, trembling as they traced the crude letters. Ryan, Jesse, Dana, Mark, Lila, each name cut as though the children themselves had wanted to leave proof that they had been there, that they had not simply vanished into thin air. The revelation sent a shock through the town. No longer was the cabin just an abandoned structure or the circle of stone an unexplained curiosity. Now there was evidence, direct and undeniable, that the children had been inside that place. Reporters descended again, their questions sharp, their cameras flashing. The sheriff, though worn from years of frustration, spoke with a steadier voice than anyone had heard in a long time. The case was not only alive, it had been cracked open. Investigators worked late into the night, scanning every inch of the wall for fingerprints or traces, but the years had stripped it clean. What mattered most was not the forensics but the humanity of those marks. The children had left a message, and in doing so had proven the search had not been in vain. Theories exploded in town. Some believed the names were a plea for help, scratched into the wall in captivity. Others whispered that the carvings were forced, made under someone's watch. The sheriff did not confirm or deny, yet he allowed one truth to be spoken aloud for the first time in years. The children had been alive, at least long enough to leave their names behind. The breakthrough was small, a few crude letters in old wood, yet it was enough to light the town again. Ashbury no longer drifted in silence. Hope, fragile but burning, returned with the weight of those 5 names. When the news of the carved names spread beyond Ashbury, the town once again became the center of attention, and with it the families were pulled back into a storm they had barely survived the first time. Reporters returned with vans and cameras, setting up outside the courthouse and even on quiet neighborhood streets. Strangers called at odd hours, some offering prayers, others offering wild theories, and still others demanding to know why it had taken 5 years to uncover something so simple. The wound that had begun to scar reopened, raw and painful, and the families were left bleeding in public all over again. Ryan's father, who had once found strength in silence, was confronted outside his hardware store by journalists, demanding to know if he believed his son had been held captive in the cabin. He answered with trembling hands and a voice thick with exhaustion that he did not know, that he had never known, and the clip played on national broadcasts, as if it were confession. Dana's mother, who had tried to build some fragile routine, collapsed in the church vestibule when someone handed her a printed photo of the carvings. She wept not only for her daughter but for the sudden tearing open of grief that she had tried so hard to press down. In town, the tension returned as if no time had passed. Old arguments resurfaced, neighbors choosing sides and theories, whispers about who might have known what, suspicions sharpened once more. The diner, which had grown quieter over the years, filled again, but with conversations that left everyone shaken. Some were certain the carvings proved the children had been alive for months after they vanished. Others swore it meant the opposite, that their last desperate act had been to etch their names before the end. The sheriff tried to temper the noise, standing on the courthouse steps and insisting that the investigation had been energized, that the discovery was progress, but his words did little to calm the families who had already endured too much. For them, the truth of the names was not only evidence, it was a cruel reminder that the children had reached for help that never came. At night, candles returned to the courthouse lawn, just as they had in the first weeks of the search. Families gathered again in the flicker of light, holding hands, staring at the photographs of the cabin wall. The ache was sharper now because it carried a new edge, the knowledge that their children had been closer than they had dared to hope. The forest had whispered their names into the world, but it had done so too late. The reopened wound spread through every household in Ashbury, each parent reliving the day of disappearance, each sibling forced to imagine what those last moments had felt like. Healing had been fragile, temporary, and now it was undone. The town was once again living in the shadow of absence, more painful because hope had been stirred, then tangled in sorrow all over again. The investigators returned to the hollow each day, combing over the cabin and the circle of stones. Yet what unsettled them most was not what they found, but what they did not. The woods themselves seemed altered, too still, as if the forest had drawn in a breath and refused to release it. Men who had walked search lines for decades admitted that the silence felt heavier here, oppressive in a way that pressed against the skin. Birds that filled the rest of Ashbury Forest fell quiet as soon as the team reached the clearing. No song breaking the canopy, no rustle in the undergrowth. Even the wind seemed reluctant to pass through. Deputies marked the perimeter with tape, their radios hissing with static whenever they stepped too close to the circle of stones. Batteries drained faster than expected, flashlights dimmed, though they were new, and cameras captured frames of distortion, blurs of light where none should have been. Some of the younger officers laughed it off, calling it bad wiring or nerves, but the older men remembered the first days of the search 5 years earlier and admitted that the woods had never felt right then either. Families who gathered at the roadblocks spoke in hushed tones about the silence. Mothers swore they could feel it reaching outward, following them home at night, creeping into their kitchens and bedrooms. They said it was not just the absence of sound, but something heavier, like being watched by the trees themselves. At vigils, people prayed louder than before, their voices cracking, as though raising them might push back the stillness that had seeped into everything. The sheriff tried to keep his team focused, yet even he found himself unsettled. He stood in the hollow one evening as the sun dropped, and he realized the usual chorus of crickets never began. The hush felt unnatural, an emptiness that was not born of chance. He admitted to the state agents that he did not want his deputies left in the clearing after dark. The experts nodded, pretending not to agree, but their tight jaws betrayed them. Reporters sensed the unease and turned it into headlines. Forest of silence ran across newspapers, and speculation twisted quickly. Some claimed the circle of stones marked a place of sacrifice. Others said the cabin had been built to contain something rather than to hide within it. Theories spread faster than the sheriff could deny them, and with each telling the silence grew larger in the minds of the townspeople. For the families, the quiet was worse than noise. Noise could be explained, but silence suggested something hidden, waiting, unfinished. Each evening, as they lit candles outside the courthouse, they whispered their children's names into the heavy air, straining to hear even the faintest reply. None ever came. The silence of the forest held fast, unnatural and unbroken, a reminder that the woods were guarding a secret that no one yet understood. The decision was made to search beneath the cabin, though it had stood half-buried for so long that no one knew what they would find. The floorboards were warped and soft, the smell of rot strong enough to sting the nose, but the sheriff ordered them pried up one by one. Deputies worked carefully, the creak of crowbars echoing through the hollow, until the boards gave way to reveal a crawlspace packed with dirt and stone. It was narrow, barely high enough for a man to crouch, yet the investigators lowered lights inside, the beams cutting through the dust that swirled with every movement. At first the space seemed empty, only damp soil and the occasional scurry of mice, but soon the team noticed that the earth had been disturbed. A section near the center was darker, softer, as if it had been dug and filled again. They called in ground-penetrating scanners, and the equipment confirmed what their eyes already feared. There were cavities below, spaces too regular to be natural. Shovels were brought in, the work slow and tense, each strike into the soil carrying the weight of years of unanswered questions. The first object uncovered was a small tin box, its lid rusted, its sides warped. Inside were scraps of paper so damp they nearly dissolved at a touch, yet enough remained to see faint lines drawn by a child's hand, crude sketches of trees, a sun, and stick figures. Investigators placed the box into evidence bags with shaking hands, their voices low as they passed it to the sheriff. It was the first clear proof that children had once occupied this space, and the air in the cabin grew heavier with the realization. Digging continued, and deeper still they uncovered fragments of fabric, faded and fragile. A sleeve with a button still clinging, a torn edge of denim, threads that time had nearly erased. No bodies were found, no bones, yet the presence of belongings told a story darker than words could. The children had been there, beneath the cabin, hidden away in the dirt where no one would ever have thought to look. News of the find spread fast, and the town gathered once more at the courthouse. Some wept at the confirmation, others demanded answers, but all understood that what had been uncovered was not the end, only another step into the depths of a mystery that seemed endless. The forest had given up fragments, but not the truth, and the silence that followed was heavier than before. The sheriff stood by the cabin as the night fell, the crawlspace now exposed like a wound. He knew more digging would come, more searching of the depths both of the earth and of the past. For now, he could only look into the hollow beneath the cabin and feel the weight of absence pressing from below, a reminder that what they sought might never come fully into the light. The digging beneath the cabin grew more deliberate after the discovery of the tin box and the scraps of fabric. Investigators worked in shifts, the sound of shovels and picks steady in the damp air, until the soil finally gave way to something solid. At first it was only the edge of stone, smooth and flat, unlike the jagged rocks scattered through the rest of the earth. As they cleared more, the outline revealed itself, a square too perfect to be natural, a concealed entry, sealed by time and layers of dirt. It took hours to pry it open. The stone slab was heavy, the hinges beneath it rusted, but with enough force it lifted, releasing a rush of air that carried the smell of old water and decay. Flashlights were lowered into the opening, their beams cutting through the dark to reveal a set of steps carved directly into the stone. The sheriff ordered the chamber below to be mapped and photographed before anyone descended, yet the urgency was plain on his face. This was no crawl space. It was something deliberately built, hidden below the earth, waiting to be found. When the first investigator climbed down, the chamber swallowed him in silence. The walls were stone, damp and close, the air heavy with the scent of mildew. The room stretched wider than expected, perhaps 20 feet across, the ceiling just high enough to stand. Along one wall were wooden shelves collapsing under their own rot, stacked with cans whose labels had long since faded. Rusted tins lay scattered across the floor, their contents spoiled into unrecognizable sludge. Against another wall stood 2 cots, thin frames with what remained of mattresses clinging to them, the fabric stained and brittle with age. The detail that silenced everyone was not the shelves or the beds, but the walls themselves. In the beam of the flashlights, faint markings could be seen, drawn in crayon or chalk, clinging to the stone despite the damp. Childlike sketches of houses, of stick figures holding hands, of suns and trees. One drawing showed 5 small figures standing together inside a ring, with taller figures drawn outside of it, their shapes crude but menacing. The images froze the search team in place. They were not just remnants of children being kept there, they were a message, fragments of lives pressed into the stone itself. Word of the chamber reached the families before the official report, and with it came a new wave of grief. Some clung to hope, saying the children must have lived long enough to draw these pictures, while others broke down, convinced the chamber was a tomb rather than a shelter. The sheriff said little, only that the search was expanding, that every inch would be examined. For the town, the discovery was both a breakthrough and a curse. The mystery had deepened, the horror sharpened, and though answers felt closer, the chamber beneath the cabin offered only silence. It was a silence that spoke louder than words, telling Ashbury that the forest had hidden far more than they had ever imagined. Among the decaying shelves in the subterranean chamber, wedged between 2 rusted tins and a broken lantern, an investigator found something unexpected. It was a small notebook, the kind sold cheaply at corner stores, its cover warped with water damage and its edges chewed by mildew. The pages inside were stiff and stained, but still legible in places. The sheriff ordered it sealed and delivered straight to the evidence lab, but word spread before the night ended. For the first time since the disappearance, there were words left behind, a voice pressed into paper. The journal was handled with gloves, each page turned carefully beneath bright lights. At first, the entries seemed almost innocent, filled with crude drawings and simple notes that could only have been written by children. There were lines about games played in the dark, marks that suggested days were being counted, tally after tally scratched into margins. But as the pages moved forward, the handwriting grew frantic, the sentences shorter, the spelling broken. One page read simply, "We are still here." The letters pressed so hard the pencil had nearly ripped through the paper. Experts confirmed the handwriting matched samples taken from school assignments of the missing children. The realization struck the families like lightning. Their children had not only been in the chamber, they had left behind their thoughts, their fear, their desperate proof of life. Parents were brought into the station one by one and shown the entries. Many could not finish reading. One father had to leave the room when he recognized a doodle of a dog his daughter had drawn 100 times before in her notebooks at home. Not every page was clear. Water had erased entire sections, leaving only smudges and torn fibers. Yet what remained painted a picture more chilling than any theory had before. Mentions of "the man" appeared, always written the same way, with uneven strokes and darkened pencil. No name, only those 2 words. "The man says be quiet," one line read. "The man brings food," said another. The most haunting entry came near the end, when the handwriting broke into jagged scrawls. "The man is angry. We want to go home." The sheriff refused to release all the contents, but enough leaked to fuel a storm of fear and fury. In the diner, neighbors argued over who "the man" could have been. Some whispered it had to be someone local, someone trusted, someone who knew the land well enough to hide the chamber. Others spoke of strangers, drifters who passed through unnoticed. Every theory reopened the wound, and suspicion spread through Ashbury like smoke. For the investigators, the journal was both a gift and a curse. It confirmed the children's presence, proved they had been alive long after the day they vanished, but it also raised darker questions. Who had the man been, and how had he moved unseen for so long? The journal spoke in fragments, a chorus of young voices crying out across years of silence. And though it could not tell the full story, it made one thing certain. The children had not vanished without a trace. They had left words behind, and those words would haunt the town forever. When the analysts finished going through the journal page by page, they found something most had overlooked at first. In the back half of the notebook, after the frantic entries and the desperate lines about wanting to go home, were passages that did not sound like children at all. The handwriting was rougher, heavier, and though the words were still in pencil, the strokes pressed so deep they cut into the paper beneath. Investigators argued over whether it was one of the older kids trying to imitate an adult, but handwriting experts insisted the style did not match any of the missing children. Someone else had written in that notebook. The words were chilling. They spoke of rules, of silence, of obedience. They must not speak when the night comes, one line read. Another said, if they listen, they will be safe. If they do not, they will be punished. The phrases repeated over and over, scratched into the margins and between the drawings, as if whoever wrote them was trying to drill the rules into whoever read them. The investigators quickly understood. This was the voice of the man, intruding into the only outlet the children had, leaving his warnings alongside their cries for help. The families were called in again, and this time the reaction was different. No one sobbed, no one collapsed. They sat in silence, absorbing the weight of the revelation. It was no longer only a story of children trapped underground. It was the story of control, of someone asserting himself over them with rules and threats. Dana's mother whispered that the handwriting looked like a sermon, harsh and unyielding, as if the writer believed he was saving the children even as he held them captive. The sheriff spoke carefully at the press conference, avoiding details, but the truth slipped out quickly. Reporters seized on the idea that the notebook had been shared, that it contained not just the voices of the children but of their captor as well. Headlines the next morning carried phrases like, "The man's words revealed," and "Captive rules in Forest notebook." The town reacted with fury and dread, many convinced this meant the abductor had been close, perhaps even someone they knew, a face they had trusted for years. Arguments broke out at the diner, in church pews, and at the gas station. Some swore the language sounded like a preacher they once knew. Others thought of a school volunteer, a farmer who lived near the woods, a neighbor whose odd behavior now seemed sinister. Suspicion spread like a sickness, and the unnatural silence that had hung over the forest now stretched into the town itself. People avoided eye contact, friendships cracked, and the sense of safety that had been fragile was destroyed. The investigators understood the danger of releasing too much, yet even in secrecy the revelation shifted the case. They were no longer searching only for traces of the missing. They were hunting a man whose voice had already been found. The journal had spoken, and what it said was more disturbing than anyone had imagined. The autumn of 2017 brought with it one last attempt to push the case forward. Technology had advanced since the first flights, and a local volunteer group purchased a drone capable of carrying higher-resolution cameras and thermal sensors. It was decided to make one more survey of Ashbury Forest, a final sweep before the leaves fell and the landscape was hidden again. The town gathered in uneasy silence as the team prepared the flight, everyone aware that 5 long years had passed since the children vanished, and yet the forest still guarded its secrets. The drone lifted from the clearing near the cabin, its blades buzzing as it rose above the tree line. The live feed streamed onto a monitor, watched closely by deputies, volunteers, and weary parents who had grown used to disappointment. At first, the images were familiar. Endless swaths of dense woodland, the uneven ridges that marked old logging trails, and patches of undergrowth where deer slipped silently through. Nothing seemed unusual. Then the drone moved deeper, following a narrow gully that few had dared to enter on foot. The thermal camera switched on, its view glowing with pockets of warmth from animals below. For a long stretch, the screen showed only scattered dots of wildlife, but then a shape appeared that froze the crowd in place. It was not a deer or a fox, but a rectangular patch of heat, steady and distinct, as if something man-made was holding warmth beneath the earth. The pilot steadied the drone, lowering it carefully toward the source. As the camera adjusted, the forest floor came into view, thick with vines and moss, but there was something beneath it, an outline too straight to be natural. A door, perhaps metal, nearly hidden by years of growth. The monitor displayed the edges clearly, the faint sheen of rust where sunlight caught. Gasps rippled through the crowd, parents clutching hands, investigators exchanging sharp glances. For a moment hope surged. Could this be another chamber, another hidden place tied to the children? But with the hope came dread. The last chamber had given them drawings and scraps of life, but also silence, decay, and despair. The sheriff ordered the coordinates logged and the drone to circle again, capturing every angle. The feed showed no movement nearby, no sign of anyone watching, yet the forest seemed to grow heavier with each passing second. The drone finally returned to base, its blades chopping the air as it landed in the dirt. The monitor went dark, but the image of that hidden door remained burned in the minds of all who had seen it. The sheriff announced that the site would be secured and excavated in the coming days, but his voice carried little certainty. The families stood in the clearing, torn between hope and fear, knowing that whatever waited beneath that patch of earth might bring closure, or might open a wound that could never heal. The excavation of the hidden door began at first light. Deputies marked off the area, while a small team of workers cleared away the heavy tangle of roots and vines. The air was sharp with autumn frost, the ground damp and stubborn, but slowly the outline revealed itself in full. What they uncovered was not just a hatch, but a reinforced slab of metal, bolted into stone, its hinges sealed with rust. It had been built to last, and it had succeeded in staying hidden for years. The family stood together on the ridge above, silent and pale, bracing for what might be found. When the slab was finally pried open, the sound of metal grinding against stone echoed through the trees. A rush of air drifted up, stale and foul, carrying with it the scent of mold and something older that no one wished to name. Flashlights were lowered into the darkness, beams sweeping across a stairwell cut into the ground. The sheriff ordered the team down, and one by one they descended, their voices low, their boots echoing against the stone. The chamber below was larger than the first, and far more deliberate. The walls were lined with wooden shelves, still holding jars of preserved food long spoiled, their glass coated with dust. In the center of the room stood a long wooden table, its surface scarred and stained, surrounded by small chairs. The site was unbearable, a gathering place built underground, as if someone had tried to create a twisted version of a home. But it was what hung on the far wall that made every breath stop. There, pinned in neat rows, were drawings like the ones found before. Only these were clearer, untouched by water or decay. They showed the same 5 figures, but older, taller, their hair longer, their faces drawn with more detail. The children had been alive here long after anyone believed possible. In the corner of the wall, scrawled in uneven letters, was a line that froze the investigators in place. "We are still waiting." Gasps filled the chamber, some of disbelief, others of grief too sharp to contain. The words had not been written in 2012 or 2013, but much later. Experts would later say the writing was no more than a year old. This meant that at least some of the children had survived long after the case had gone cold. The silence that followed was heavier than the earth pressing down above them. When the sheriff emerged, his face gray, he said only that the truth would change everything. The children had not simply vanished, nor had they all perished in the first months. They had been kept, year after year, hidden beneath the forest, waiting for help that never came. The unbelievable truth was not just that the mystery had stretched on for so long, but that hope had been alive all along, buried under roots and silence, calling out in words no one had heard until it was too late.